So the project of the book was to write about how do these great presidents and worst presidents, what do they have in common in their attitudes towards the Constitution? And what is it that made some of them great and some of them bad? And one thing that's obvious, I think, is that our greatest presidents, were presidents during time of emergencies and wars and crises, right? They were not presidents during periods of peace and quiet.
Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm George Gillum, the chair of the forum. John Yoo, who last spoke here in 2003, earned his undergraduate degree, summa cum laude, at Harvard University. There he was a student of my colleague and good friend here, Brian Ballow. Professor Ballow once quipped to Mr. Yoo that Yoo was one of the brightest students he ever had, and he was certain that one day Mr. Yoo would run the world, but he was not certain he wanted to live in that world. So Professor Hughes did not suddenly become controversial in the recent past. Following Harvard, he graduated from Yale Law School and clerked on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge Lawrence Silberman, and then he clerked on the Supreme Court for Clarence Thomas. He served as general counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee and has been on the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, at the law school there since 1993. He's written on presidential power and the war on terror. His most recent book is Crisis and Command, A History of Executive Power from George Washington to George W. Bush. John Yoo is most infamously known for his work for the George W. Bush administration, which he served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel in the United States Department of Justice from 2001 to 2003. His views on the wartime powers of the executive, especially on warrantless searches, domestic intelligence, enhanced interrogation techniques, and other issues have aroused strong passions and have called into question on the some part his judgment as a lawyer. All of this is why we invite John Yoo to speak. Please welcome John Yoo. Please be seated. Please be seated.
Just why don't you wait till the end? You can take a question.
Yeah.
Why don't you ask a question? I'll take it. Okay? I'll take it.
Please be seated.
I'd be happy to take your question and any other questions afterwards. I'm going to devote more than half of the time for questions and answers. So,
thank you all very much. And now let's listen to our speaker.
I'd like to, thank you for the invitation to speak here. I also like to thank George for arranging things so I would feel at home as if I were in Berkeley, California, where we have raised protesting to a fine, fine art. This is a great pleasure to come back to the Miller Center and to speak about my new book, Crisis and Command, which is a history of presidential power between the times of Washington and George W. Bush. It's also a great pleasure to come here because, as George said, my undergraduate thesis advisor is on the faculty, Brian Ballow, who is a member of the history department and on the roster of the Miller Center. And in fact, just to correct the record, as I often have to do about a great many things, Brian did say when I was a student in a seminar that he was sure if I ever ran the country, not the world. I wasn't that ambitious. If I ever ran the country, he was sure it would be a well-run country, but he just wouldn't to live in that country. And George never described my reply, which was, now, after I've had my chance, I see Brian has not left the country. So he hasn't lived up to his promise back from 25 years ago. But he still has time if he wants to change his mind. So let me start by talking about what's on everybody's mind here, I'm sure, which is my appearance on the Jon Stewart Daily Show. I don't know how many of you saw this, but some of you may be surprised to learn that for the younger generation, the Jon Stewart Show is the leading show by which our students get their daily news. It is, in fact, a comedy show. But I went on the show at the beginning of January, against the advice of most every conservative friend I had. And apparently I did so well, or at least frustrated Mr. Stewart so much, that on the next day's show, he started off by saying that I'd beaten him. And according to the students, this had never happened before. So I tried to figure out what it was that allowed me to do so well on the great liberal talk show of our day. So I went back and I looked at the tapes, which is something I hate to do usually. And I saw afterwards and thought about it. And I realized they probably never had a law professor, probably not a college professor on a show, because what I thought I did was I went on and I treated it like class. And if you think about what professors do, is we spend our careers trying to keep young college-age kids somewhat in order, even though they've done no reading or preparation for class. And if you think about this, this is pretty much the position of most talk show hosts. So anyway, that's my story about the Jon Stewart Show. Let me turn to the book, which I'm glad to speak here because it's very much on the topic for which this center is really in existence, which is to study the presidency. And I decided to write the book a few years after leaving the administration because I saw a poll that was published back in 2005, 2006. And it was a scientific poll of sorts that surveyed 300 political scientists, historians, law professors of all different political parties and points of view, asking them to rank all the presidents in American history in order. And the results might be surprising. They're certainly not necessarily in line with how most, I think, sort of everyday Americans think of when they think of who the greatest presidents are. So just to give you a sense of what sort of regular people think of in terms of great presidents, that scholarly publication, Parade Magazine, did a poll a few months ago asking randomly selected people what presidents ought to be added to Mount Rushmore. So who do you think most people said? And one has to take out of the results those answers which already named presidents who were on Mount Rushmore. But who do you think most regular Americans would say ought to be added to Mount Rushmore as our fifth greatest president? No, FDR is who I might have thought, but no. No. Bill Clinton, no. Reagan is who I thought, but Reagan actually turned out to be third. Truman Truman wasn't even on the list. So I'll give you the answer. I mean, I'm actually surprised you all can't get this. Actually, when I speak in front of undergraduate audiences, someone usually gets it right away. It's John F. Kennedy. Right? And why? Because if you think about it, because Kennedy is the first TV president, a glamorous, young, energetic president, young, attractive-looking family. Where do you think he rates in the ranking of presidents? He's right now ranked about average, and in fact has suffered quite a decline over the last 20 years. As the archives have opened, his reputation gets worse and worse. In fact, some of the names people throughout are on some of the responses, like Reagan and so on, is FDR. I'll point out also on the list that President Obama was already fifth on the list of people who ought to be added to Mount Rushmore. Well, this is somewhat at odds with the scholars' results. Right, so the first scholars rank, first two presidents are in fact already on Mount Rushmore, Washington and Lincoln. The third greatest president in the scholarly rankings is FDR, and the fourth is Jefferson, and the fifth is Teddy Roosevelt. So they're all on Mount Rushmore. But the other people who make the top 10, some of them barely made the poll, some of them barely were in the consciousness of Americans today. So Reagan, though, is on there. He was sixth in the scholars ranking, which for I think most academics would come as a great shock, that academics think Reagan is the sixth greatest president in history. If you remember Reagan's reputation amongst intellectuals and academics at the end of his presidency, he was, I think, fairly uniformly ranked as a mediocre president. And it's only over time that, until now, that his reputation has really improved. Someone like him who's 7th in the rankings is Harry Truman, who someone mentioned. Harry Truman also is someone, when he left office, was thought of as a very poor president. His approval rankings were in the low 30s at the time he left office. It's only with the change and the study of history, and people appreciate now the decisions Truman made at the beginning of the Cold War that really set the policy of containment towards the Soviet Union that every president after him followed. That people tend to think now of Truman as being one of our great presidents. 8th greatest president in the poll, I think would also come as a great surprise to scholars, is Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower, when he left office, right, was thought of as being a kind of grandfatherly, out-of-touch chairman of the board who liked to play a lot of golf, right, and was ranked as, again, a sort of mediocre or average president. Again, with the opening of the archives, Eisenhower's reputation has really increased because people appreciate now that Eisenhower really was in command of his administration. He really was somebody who was making a lot of the fundamental decisions of the day. And 9th is Polk, who probably most Americans have not heard of. A lot of people, certainly in California, have never heard of Polk, even though he's responsible for adding California to the Union. Although I suspect here on the East Coast, some people may want to return the country back. Right, President Polk, probably our most successful one-term president, really triggered the Mexican-American War of 1848, and because of that added, right, some of the, in my opinion, some of the best states to the Union. But again, not someone who's regularly listed by most people as being a great president. Then the 10th greatest president by scholarly rankings is President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who actually I would say right now is not doing very well amongst scholars and historians. The other thing that's interesting about the poll, and something I wanted to write about, was the worst presidents, which is something we often don't write about or think about that hard, but what makes bad presidents bad? So this will be, I promise, the last time I'm going to throw out a quiz, but who do you think scholars uniformly voted as the worst president in American history? And to just give you a hint, no naming anyone who's been president in the last 15 years. Oh, yeah, someone said Buchanan, right? That's very good. Nope, it's Buchanan, actually. And Buchanan, when I go speak in college audiences, I have to say, no, it's not Pat Buchanan. Right? You know, because the younger folks, they kind of think, God, he might have been president when I was 10 or 11, I'm not sure. Although I do promise you, if he had been elected president, I'm sure he would have sank rapidly down towards challenging James Buchanan for the worst. Some of the other presidents down there are people probably never heard of. Franklin Pierce, but then of course others would be Richard Nixon, but others you might not have heard of, Andrew Johnson. I'm going to make a case why, a heretical case why James Madison actually might be thought of as added to that list as well. So the project of the book that I started out with was to write about how do these great presidents and worst presidents, what do they have in common in their attitudes towards the Constitution? And what is it that made some of them great and some of them bad? And one thing that's obvious, I think, from the list is that our greatest presidents, were presidents during time of emergencies and wars and crises, right? They were not presidents during periods of peace and quiet. But it's more than that, I thought. It's not just that they happened to be president during a great emergency, but that, and here's the provocative part of the thesis, is that they were people who interpreted their constitutional powers very broadly, and honestly, at times, in conflict with what the other branches of government thought and wanted to do. And that our worst presidents actually were sometimes presidents during these same challenges, interpreted their constitutional powers quite narrowly, shrank into a shell, and sometimes deferred to the other branches for leadership. Now, let's just try to explain this through some of the historical examples, but really the big focus is going to be on the huge change between Buchanan, our very worst president, and Lincoln, perhaps our greatest president. And I think that really bears out the thesis. But take Washington, for example, who was number one in, I think, most scholars' views on who the greatest president is, just barely edging out Lincoln. Also, if you're curious, I have all the scores and everything in the book itself with the rankings and everything if you really want to know the exact order. So we are Americans, we like to rank everything in top 10 lists. Washington obviously would have been considered a great American even if he'd never been president because of the victory in the Revolutionary War. But a lot of the things he did as president are sometimes overlooked because he was not a great writer, did not give great speeches. But he made a lot of fundamental decisions about the presidency within which we live today and which give it its modern shape and context, but which we just don't appreciate because we live in it today. For example, when Washington took office, he immediately decided that the presidency was an independent constitutional office with the right to set its own policies. He could have read the Constitution's text as making him a prime minister, as making his primary function to carry out the choices of Congress. And there have been presidents in our history who have pretty much read the job in that way. But Washington's really one who said, I was elected differently from the Congress, and I have different responsibilities. I have the right to set policy myself. In fact, in other areas, he did that in ways that are quite in tension with the text of the Constitution. One of the stories I tell in the book is his reading of the advice and consent clause in the Constitution. So when Washington decided to negotiate the very first treaty in our history under the new Constitution with the Indian tribes, he actually looked at the Constitution and said the president shall make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. So taking that language, he actually wrote up a list of questions and went over to the Senate and went into the well of the Senate and pulled out his questions and started to ask the senators to take their advice. So I know some people here have worked at times in various legislatures. You know, how many people think he got to question number 2? He never got to question number 2, right? What he did do is spark a lot of senators giving speeches, yelling at each other, cross-examining the president about his views. So after 3 hours of this, Washington, who you're all familiar with here, living in Virginia, is a very big man, a guy with a terrible temper. After 3 hours, he just jumps right up and just bursts out of the Senate chamber. And he's heard to say as he leaves, apparently, I'll be damned if I ever step foot there again. Right? And that is the first and last time a president has ever sought the advice of the Senate before he negotiates a treaty, nominates a Supreme Court justice, or picks a cabinet member. Washington's action, with which every president has followed since, was essentially to read advice and consent to really be about consent, not formal advice. But the more important thing Washington did during his presidency was to read the Constitution as giving him the power to set foreign policy. Again, you could say the Constitution's text, read on its own, doesn't clearly give either the president or the Congress the power to decide whether we're going to be friendly to Iran or hostile to Iran or friendly to France or hostile to France, to set the basic position of the United States towards other countries. And in fact, those of you in law school, and I know there, in fact, I've seen skulking about even law professors in the audience, you know that the textual basis for the president's authority in foreign affairs is sometimes linked to things like his right to receive ambassadors from foreign countries, as if that gave the president, therefore, the right to set foreign policy, because we have to decide which ambassadors get tea in the fancy china versus the less fancy china. Right? It's not clear. It's just not clear and obvious from the beginning, from just the reading of the text, who gets to set foreign policy. So when the great foreign policy crisis of our early history erupted, the French Revolution and our attitude towards the British and the French, Washington immediately decided that he was going to set the United States' policy towards those other countries. And in fact, what he does, he immediately called a cabinet meeting, the first cabinet meeting in our history. He asks the various members, what should we do? Should we honor our treaties with France from 1778 and lend them assistance? Or should we break the treaties, not help the French? What should our position be? He asks the cabinet and decides not to consult with Congress, not to call Congress into session, that it's a presidential decision. Right? Ultimately, as you know, he decides to declare the neutrality of the United States in the wars in Europe, which I think most people agree was the best policy for the United States at the time. But from a constitutional perspective, he took for the presidency the power to set foreign policy. Again, something presidents to this day have never broken with. He does it at a great political price, mind you, right? Thomas Jefferson and James Madison essentially found the Democratic Party, the first partisan political party under the Constitution, because they accused Washington of seizing monarchical powers. Right? The second great president, let's describe him in the Constitution, is Lincoln. And here I think the contrast between Buchanan, who's rarely talked about, and Lincoln is quite sharp, and I think quite on point with the thesis of the book. Right, James Buchanan was actually one of the more accomplished people to be elected president. He was Secretary of State, Senator, and so on from my home state of Pennsylvania. President Buchanan actually believed that secession was unconstitutional. And in the period between his election, Lincoln's election and the inauguration, as southern states started to secede, Buchanan actually issued a legal opinion of his own writing which declared secession to be unconstitutional. But he also said, as a legal matter, I don't have the constitutional authority to stop the southern states from leaving the Union, even though I think it is unconstitutional. I don't see a clause in Article 2 of the Constitution which discusses the president's powers which give the president the right to use force against a state. That was his view. And for doing nothing, right, as the secession approached, he's uniformly ranked as our worst president. Contrast that with Lincoln. Right? Lincoln takes office. He has the same constitutional view as Buchanan about secession. That's something that people just have overlooked over time. There was no difference between the two. Their difference was on the power of the president to stop it from happening. Right? And as you all know, Lincoln took extraordinary measures at the very beginning of the Civil War. Right? He raised an army and navy. He took money out of the Treasury. He sent that army and navy into offensive operations against the South, right? All without congressional approval. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He, in fact, defied a judicial order by the Chief Justice of the United States to release spies and saboteurs and sympathizers that the military had detained in Maryland. And I think his greatest act as president, the Emancipation Proclamation, right, is undertaken as what we would today call a unilateral exercise of presidential power. Right? The Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, is taken pursuant to President Lincoln's powers as Commander-in-Chief, which is why, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, is not a very poetic, moving document. As I think Frederick Douglass said at the time, it read like a bill of lading. Right? It's a very precise legal document that sets out exactly where emancipation occurs or it doesn't occur, and it only occurs in the areas of fighting in the South. Right? The Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to the loyal parts of the North which still had slavery, which is why people often criticize the Emancipation Proclamation for actually not freeing anybody, right? Because it applied only in the areas where the Union actually didn't have any control. But the reason that Lincoln did that is because he was doing it pursuant to the Commander-in-Chief power and he did not try to extend it to areas peacefully held behind the front. In fact, he was so worried about this that this is one reason Lincoln pressed for the ratification of the 13th Amendment before the war was over, because he understood and admitted that if the war ended, his Emancipation Proclamation would end too. That the Commander-in-Chief's powers would terminate along with the war, and he didn't want to be the president to return all the slaves that he had freed as a war measure. Right? But again, Lincoln was acting quite at odds with the views of the other branches and the common understanding of constitutional law at the time. Right? I don't know if any law students in the audience, but what is the governing Supreme Court case on slavery in 1863 at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation? It's still Dred Scott. You look too old to be a law student, but maybe you've come back and are trying to get better grades. But very good answer, right?
John, what about the torture amendment?
Yeah, we'll get to that. Don't worry. So the Dred Scott is still the governing case, and you will hear about it. Don't worry, you'll hear about it at the end.
I have to say it's a time of great personal sadness. I've been here for 7 years. We've had some extremely controversial people on both sides of major issues that are facing this country, important issues, and we've always accorded them respect, even if we don't agree with them, even if we passionately disagree with them. And so we pride ourselves in this room on extending simple civil courtesy to our speakers. And we will continue to do whatever we need to preserve that atmosphere in this room.
Also, let me just say, I dimly understand that I'm controversial in various ways, and I'm more than happy to take questions of any kind on any subject once I get to finish my talk, and then there'll be at least a half hour for people to ask whatever they like. I'm certainly not afraid to take questions. One thing I very much believe, actually, is that if you serve in the government, you have a responsibility to explain why we made the decisions that we did. But if you prevent me from actually giving the answers, you're never going to hear them. So I'm not resistant or hiding any way to answer any questions you'd like to ask, but just wait your time. I would like to thank George again for duplicating a Berkeley atmosphere, though, in Virginia. I didn't think it could be done, but you've done it quite well. Thanks. So the last point I would like to make about Lincoln was just that what he was doing was his own interpretation of the Constitution. Right? It was not the interpretation held by the Supreme Court of that time. Right? Dred Scott had held that slaves were property of their owners no matter where they went in the Union, and that neither the federal government nor the state governments could pass laws trying to prevent slaves from being taken anywhere in the Union. Right? Quite at odds with the President's decision that he's going to free the slaves throughout the South. The last great president I'll talk about is the third president on the list, which is President Roosevelt, right? Franklin Roosevelt. And right now, this weekend, right, we're in the midst of a great national debate about the role of government in society and the economy. And I would just say no matter where one comes out on that debate, I think everyone would think that President Roosevelt ought to be considered a great president because of the years leading up to and including World War II. And if you look at what happened in the lead up to the war, President Roosevelt saw much earlier, I think, than most people in this country, the great threat that Germany and Japan posed to the security of the United States and to world peace. And he took a number of measures before the war, under his powers as president, to try to bring the United States into a position not just of helping the Allies, but of bringing the United States into the war earlier than most would have wanted. If you remember at the time, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts designed specifically to prevent the United States from helping the Allies, and designed specifically to prevent the United States from getting to the war. In the middle of 1941, opinion polls showed that basically at least half of all Americans still did not want the United States to become involved in World War II. President Roosevelt took a number of steps, however, to draw the United States closer to that war, quite at odds with those neutrality acts. So the one famous example is President Roosevelt's decision to trade 50 destroyers for bases with the British. He did so despite a statute which prohibited the United States from giving military weapons and armaments to any of the belligerents. His argument was that the destroyers were old, and so they were like surplus, like the kind you get in an Army and Navy store, and so it could be given away to the British. Right? But he went farther than that. Next, he started directly ordering planes built for the Army Air Corps, the predecessor to the Air Force, to be taken out of the factory floors when they're finished and directly given to Canada and from there to Great Britain. And he was asked at a press conference, how is this consistent with the Neutrality Acts, which prohibit you and the United States from giving any military aid to any of the belligerents? And Roosevelt said, his answer was, you know, aviation technology is advancing so fast, these planes are already obsolete and we have to get rid of them. Right? And Roosevelt went even farther than that. He then sent American troops to occupy Greenland and Iceland to free up British troops so they could fight in the war. He eventually ordered the United States Navy to escort convoys across the Atlantic, and he secretly ordered, we now know, those American vessels to attack German submarines, which they did. And he, now we know from the archives, told Winston Churchill in early 1941 that he was trying to create a military incident in the North Atlantic so that the United States would enter the war after a German submarine attack. Right? Did all these things quite inconsistent with the policy set out by Congress in the Neutrality Act. He did it because he thought that this was in the best interest of the country's security, and he did under his commander-in-chief power. And I think most people would agree today that it was a good thing Roosevelt had done that, and in fact it would have been better for the country and in fact for the world if the United States had entered World War II even earlier than it did. So let me talk just very briefly about the presidents who ranked at the worst of the scholars' ranking. And we talked about Buchanan. Let me try to argue for James Madison. Might be a great hero in this part of the country. I think he lived just a few minutes from here. Now, Madison was maybe perhaps the greatest political scientist who ever became president. No offense to Woodrow Wilson. Right? Madison wrote the first draft of the Constitution. He wrote the first draft of the Bill of Rights. He was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers and one of the outstanding politicians in favor of the ratification of the Constitution. He becomes a great critic of Washington and the Neutrality Proclamation and what he sees as a great expansion of presidential power. He does not make a very good president. Part of it might just be his temperament. I mean, people who've written about him point out that Madison was a short guy, 5'1", he had a high squeaky voice, he didn't like meeting people, he didn't like giving speeches. He was one of those fellows who loved to be on committees and draft committee reports. You can imagine why professors have such great sympathy for the man. He's not really have an executive temperament. And in fact, because of that, because of his reading of the narrowness of the presidency, he allowed the United States to be driven into war by Congress that could have been perhaps the worst war as a matter of strategy that we ever got involved in. Putting aside all the destructive, terrible wars we've been in the past, the War of 1812, if you think about it, could have been perhaps the worst strategic blunder we've ever made. You think about the context of the times. Right? Britain and France, the two great superpowers of the day, are waging a war to the death. The United States is sitting neutral, making, in fact, a lot of money, selling to both sides, which we often like to do when Europeans are at war. What do? We declare war on the only side in the conflict that has a navy. Right? We declare war on the only side that shares a border with us with troops along it. Right? And look at the results. Why did we do this, in fact? We did it because the war hawks, which is a phrase actually that was invented to describe congressmen, the war hawks in the Congress in 1812 wanted to take over Canada. So what happened in the War of 1812 was that we declared war so that we could take over Canada. And I have to say, as an immigrant to the country, I've never understood the American fascination with invading and taking over Canada. It seems that we have things very much the way we like them, where all these smart Canadians move here anyway to take advantage of our higher salaries. But at this time, there was this great obsession with invading and taking over Canada, and it failed miserably. Right? If you remember the context of that war, Canada, so Great Britain at the time, defeats all our efforts to invade Canada to the north. We are blockaded along the eastern seaboard and have no shipping or contact with the continent. And the British, with a fairly small force, invade, occupy, and burn down our capital. And at the Battle of New Orleans, their plan was to land a troop of veterans and drive up the Mississippi and split the country in two and prevent the United States from ever expanding to the west. And I think the United States was extremely lucky that we ended with essentially a draw.
It's a filibuster.
Please.
But because of the War of 1812, you can see, I think, part of the thesis, which is that Madison thought as president that it was not his decision whether the United States ought to go to war or not. He didn't think as president he had the power to stop the country from going into war. He thought it was up to Congress. And I think a president with a broader view of his authority would at least have said, I'm not going to allow a declaration of war to go forward, and if you declare it, I'm not going to wage it as commander-in-chief. But the narrow view of his office prevented him from doing that. So let me just take 3 lessons from this history about what I think it shows about the president's powers, and then I will open it up to questions. One is that, at least in my view, what the framers did when they created the presidency was to create a part of the government that was in existence specifically to handle emergencies, unforeseen crises, and war. If you look at the Federalist Papers, they describe the presidency as being there because they knew Congress could not handle and could not anticipate future emergencies. And that's why they designed the executive branch in the weird way that it's designed. And it has only one person as the president, and that person still, even to this day, is responsible for most of the decisions made in that branch. The reason they did that is because they thought one person could act with the speed and decisiveness that a large legislature lacked. But because of that, I also think a presidential power should fluctuate. right? That during periods where we aren't in emergency or war, the framers expected, and our history for the most part has shown, that the president's powers would recede, and that Congress would be the primary branch in terms of making policy, and that the president's role, if you look at the Federalist Papers and the discussion of the veto power and so on, the president's role was really to check the excesses of Congress in domestic affairs, but not to really be the kind of presidency we have had for many decades, where the president is seen as the leader of domestic programs and responsible for creating a sort of coherent national program and pressing it through the legislature. Second point is that even in these periods of heightened presidential power, the other branches have plenty of checks on that power, which they have consistently used. The end of the Vietnam War, in fact, comes because of Congress's cutoff of funds. Right? If Congress wanted to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan today, they could easily do so by reducing the funding or cutting them off. If they wanted to close Guantanamo Bay, they could do it tomorrow if they wanted to, simply by not passing money for the base. Congress, in fact, did this in a historical episode I discovered writing about James Polk. James Polk, at the end of the War of 1848, actually considered not just taking California, Nevada, and Arizona away from Mexico, he actually considered annexing all of Mexico to the United States. And people in Congress who were worried about this stopped that by cutting off all money for any military operations after the fall of Mexico City. Ultimately, Congress has the power of impeachment, which some people say, oh, that's never going to be used. But if you look at the time it was used, during a period of Reconstruction, right, it shows you how Congress can get its way in foreign policy and national security if it wants. Right? President Johnson is impeached not because he actually committed any kind of felony or crime, but because he had a different view of what the policy towards the South ought to be at the end of the Civil War than did the Congress. And the Congress used the impeachment power essentially to drive him out of office. They didn't remove him, but Congress won, right? And Congress put into place a much tougher peace than President Johnson wanted. And the last lesson I'll point out is even in these periods of great use of presidential power by some of our great presidents, they do it knowing and understanding that they are going to be attacked, that it's going to trigger a violent reaction from the political system. You mentioned Washington's actions give rise to the creation of the first partisan political party. Washington is accused of being a British spy, of being a monarchist, which I think is very hurtful to the person who thinks he's the father of the country. President Lincoln, right, in the 1864 elections is challenged by George McClellan, his former general-in-chief, who accuses Lincoln of being a dictator and at the same time as being an incompetent one, and says that he will sue for peace immediately with the South should he win. And of course, President Roosevelt, we see this even today, President Roosevelt is accused of being a socialist, an autocrat, and so on. So let me close with one last effort to be provocative and make a small comment about the Obama administration. I think when President Obama took office, I think he had a view of the presidency was somewhat reversed from the one I'm trying to sketch. One where he saw the presidency as actually the leader of transformation at the domestic level, that the president would be this person who brought coherence to a national program and would push it through the legislature rather than acting as a check on the legislature, and at the same time that he would pull back from the use of presidential power in foreign affairs. At a constitutional level, that's one way to understand his administration's decision to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in New York City in civilian court, or the sort of automatic decision to treat the bomber in Detroit on Christmas Day as a criminal suspect. If you think about that from a constitutional perspective, as aside from the policy issues, which I think are very serious, from a constitutional perspective, President Obama is deferring to the courts, to another branch of government, to set policy on terrorism. Sort of a, right, he's taking as, or placing the executive branch in sort of a deferential role there. I think this would have been very surprising to previous presidents in previous wars. Well, let me end by saying I think the challenging thing, the interesting thing is that in more recent times, I think President Obama is actually turning to a much more vigorous vision of the presidency and its powers in foreign affairs that are much more in common with his predecessors. For example, the decision to surge troops to Afghanistan. Right? And by the way, I don't remember people complaining about Congress not being consulted about that. His decision to stick to the withdrawal schedule in Iraq, I'm sure. And let me close. The last thing he's been doing, I think, with actually increased rate than the Bush administration, the use of Predator drones to fire missiles at suspected al-Qaeda leaders throughout Pakistan and Afghanistan. According to the latest figures, he's doing that more in this last year than in the previous 5 years of the Bush administration. And that has to rely on the idea that we're at war. Right? You can't fire missiles at criminal suspects before they do anything. And it relies on a very broad vision of the president's powers in foreign affairs to launch missiles at al-Qaeda leaders no matter where they are in the world and no matter on whose territory. Right? So I'll close by saying I think it's actually ironic that if President Obama, in the end, his reputation is going to be formed and where he sits on the list is going to be due not so much to what happens in domestic affairs, but what happens in foreign affairs. And it'll be doubly ironic if he has to find his place on this list by relying on a view of presidential powers that is as broad as the ones that his predecessors for the past few decades have held. So thank you for bearing with me, and I look forward to your questions.
Let me open, John, if I may, by reading an excerpt from the David Margolis memorandum dated January 5th, 2010. What he says towards the end of this report is, while I have declined to adopt the findings of misconduct of the Office of Professional Conduct, I fear that John Yoo's loyalty to his own ideology and convictions clouded his views of his obligations to his client and led him to author opinions that reflected his own extreme, albeit sincerely held, views of executive power while speaking for an institutional client. It goes on to say, these memoranda suggest that he failed to appreciate the enormous responsibilities that comes with the authority to issue institutional decisions that carry the authoritative weight of the Department of Justice. In light of the questions that have been raised about the impartiality and even the accuracy of your legal memoranda, what does this do to the opinions that you expressed early in the war on terror?
Well, first, let me say that, Mr. Margolis' view is that he rejected finding of any kind of professional misconduct, but he concluded that I and the other lawyers in the office at the time exercised poor judgment or bad judgment. And I'll say, first, I respect Mr. Margolis' opinion. I mean, he's a civil servant been in the Justice Department for, I think, 40 years, since the Nixon administration. And I never worked with him, but he's sort of famous within the department as being the sort of ultimate professional civil servant. He has his view about the fact that he thinks we exercise bad judgment and that we're driven by ideology. I think lawyers, especially dealing with questions like this, are going to differ and think that people on the other side exercise poor judgment. And if the Supreme Court, if the worst they could call each other in the majority and dissenting opinions was that they had poor judgment, the decisions would be actually really short. Because that's the reason we have majority and dissenting opinions, even at the Supreme Court. In the elite cases, the hardest cases, 5 justices of the Supreme Court can disagree, and they will accuse each other against 4 justices who disagree, and they'll accuse each other of much worse things than poor judgment. So, but let me also say, these questions that we faced after 9/11, I do disagree with his idea that this was driven by ideology. I mean, Frank, these are not questions that any of us ever wished or hoped that we'd ever have to confront in the government. These are questions that were thrust on us by the 9/11 attacks. These are not questions that any government servant ever hopes to or ever wants to address, and I wish we never had to, frankly, and I didn't go into the government in order to do so. However, I do think that what happened caused our government to have to consider these kinds of policies because of the unconventional nature of the 9/11 attacks and the unconventional nature of the enemy we fight. I mean, because we are fighting an enemy that is not a nation, that does not wear uniforms, does not organize in regular units, that conducts itself by violating all the laws of war, by deliberately targeting civilians, disguising themselves as civilians, using airliners to carry out attacks on the United States. Unfortunately, the conventional ways we fight most of our enemies in the past aren't going to work. We're not going to beat al-Qaeda by fielding larger armored divisions and driving them across Europe and capturing an enemy capital. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the conflict, the way that the United States is going to prevail is by gaining intelligence and information about the enemy's plans before they happen and trying to stop them. I think that's unfortunate, and I don't think the Obama administration disagrees with the Bush administration about that.
Next question.
I mean, the problem is that we have to figure out ways to do that, and that's why we had to confront those questions. Second thing I'll say in response to this is that I think it is a fallacy to think that the law gave obvious and clear answers to these questions. Questions about how far the United States can go in interrogation is not clearly set out by Congress. And so we in the Justice Department had to answer questions put to us by the CIA about how far can we go in interrogation so as not to violate the Congress's ban on torture. And that's the question we set out to answer. We knew at the time, and constantly reaffirmed like days like this, that those answers were going to be controversial. No matter where we drew the line, people were going to be upset and were going to disagree with us. And we understood that as well. So thank you very much for your question.
A couple quick questions, but they're just yes or no. Is there any law on the books that would prevent a wartime president from shooting a missile from a drone at a suspected enemy within the United States?
Is there any law on the books that would stop that?
Yes or no?
I think it's not. I don't think there's a law on the books. I think it's a constitutional issue. I mean, the United States can't, the government can't shoot missiles at whoever it feels like anywhere. And it can't, well, I'm not done.
No, you're done.
And
what about?
It's not a yes or no kind of answer. I mean, come on. I mean, you say, you know.
Quick follow-up question.
Let me finish.
Same question.
Let me finish my answer, though. Seriously, let me finish my answer. It depends on whether the United States is at war. If there were an enemy who actually invaded our territory and was on our territory, then obviously you would think you could shoot missiles at them, right? Just as the way in the Civil War, there was fighting on the territory of the United States. There was no law which said the Union soldiers couldn't shoot Confederate soldiers or Confederate soldiers couldn't shoot Union soldiers, right? But if we go into a wartime situation and the enemy is on our territory, the United States can use force. For example, and I'll give you, here's the answer to your question in a real, not hypothetical, real life situation, which is on the 9/11 attacks, on that day, could the United States have shot down one of those airliners before they hit the targets? Under your theory, I take it, that's a criminal act because we would be shooting a missile at a civilian airliner which was being used as a weapon against us on our own territory. And I think if you have that conclusion, you make it incapable for the United States to defend itself from terrorists. Because I think most reasonable people would agree that the United States could have shot missiles at those planes and taken, despite the terrible loss of civilian life on those planes, right? It would have been a wartime act to try to drive those planes into New York City and Washington, D.C., and would have been well within the rights of the United States in its own self-defense to use missiles to defend itself.
So, quick follow-up, because from your point of view, we are at war from here on out, and the battlefield is everywhere. So
I didn't say that.
So, well, I'm saying it for you, and here's my question.
I'm afraid that's the problem we have.
Here's the question, and you can explain why it's wrong. Is there a law on the books that would prevent an American president from dropping nuclear bombs on an American city, or on a Canadian city, or on an Iranian city? And if they're not all the same, what's the difference?
Let me put it to you this way. Could Congress pass a law that would make it a criminal act for President Truman to drop a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima? I guess under your view, Congress could. And Congress could pass a law saying you have nuclear weapons, but now we're going to make it a criminal act for you to use them. And I think that runs counter to the Constitution and American history's validation of it, investing the commander-in-chief power in the president. For good or ill, the framers made the decision that the president would be in charge of strategy and tactics once war started. And if the United States thought that we ought to drop 2 nuclear weapons on Japan to end World War II, even though that decision has been, and will always be controversial for a large number of reasons. There are a number of people who think that the use of nuclear weapons
I'm trying to get at where's the limit?
No, the use of nuclear weapons was very controversial then and now, and many people think the use of them in Japan was unnecessary and was a war crime, just as I'm sure you think in Iraq it would be. And so, well, my point is that the use of nuclear weapons is up to the president.
It's hard to know where to start with the 100 people who have died under your torture policy, with the 5,000 Americans who have died in Iraq, with the 1 million Iraqis who have died there because of your policies. I think the question is, you just said that you weren't hired because of your policies, but in fact you were hired precisely because of your policies, because Cheney knew that he could count on you. I'm getting to it. Do you think there's enough evidence to convict you of bribery? You got your job because of your policies, or just when we find the missing emails between? Be quiet. When we find the missing emails between you and the White House, will we just convict you of conspiracy to commit felonies?
Well, thank you very much for your question. First of all, I mean, this idea of bribery is a kind of silly question. I didn't know Cheney or anyone who ever worked for Cheney before I entered the government, and I had no policies on any of these questions because I'd never written about them and we'd never faced them before. It's kind of silly, but I mean, if you talk about financial loss or gain, I mean, anyone who's served in government knows that you're not going to make any money doing it. You're going to make a big loss. And in fact, one goes into the government knowing that you're sacrificing quite a lot to serve there, and it's unfortunate, but I think it's true. As to the emails, it is an honor to serve in the government. I'm willingly and happy to do it, and would do it again if I was asked. I'm sure many people here would follow me to Washington and try to stop that. But let me address the email system too, which is, I'm afraid, one thing that was in this OPR report that George mentioned was the claim that the emails that we had sent, I suppose, to the White House or various people about the interrogation issues were lost and implied destroyed. And I'm afraid that this shows how little these investigators for the Professional Responsibility Office actually understand how intelligence works in the government. Because all of the information and issues regarding this question are highly classified. In fact, at the time, I believe, was one of the most classified programs and secrets in the government. The Justice Department computer system is unsecured. You are not allowed to write any emails on it about classified information. In fact, if you did, that would be a felony. So we can, in fact, use the email system to discuss these issues, which is why there are none. So that's one. The second thing is that it seems to me, if my emails can be found on this, but the Justice Department has access to everyone else's email accounts, maybe these guys aren't good at computers, but my first guess would be you could look at the inboxes of all those other people to find all the allegedly missing emails that I sent them, right? But I think the most important thing is that you cannot actually use the email system to talk about any of this stuff within the Justice Department. That's just the way it is.
Professor Yu, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on some other attorneys' work.
Oh, boy.
There was an op-ed in last Monday's Wall Street Journal entitled Gitmo's Indefensible Lawyers, co-authored by Deborah Burlingame, who's the sister of the pilot of American Airlines Flight 77, which was crashed into the Pentagon on 9/11. The op-ed detailed certain highly unusual behavior by several attorneys representing Gitmo detainees, and now I'll get to my leading question. Do you believe that some of these defense attorneys, rather than representing the finest tradition of the legal profession, have crossed over the line from vigorous defense of an odious client to willful or perhaps naive aiding and abetting of a movement bent on the destruction of Western civilization?
Well, so you're referring to what are called the Al-Qaeda 7 and the claim that there are 7 attorneys in the Justice Department now who represented people at Guantanamo Bay very vigorously, to say the least, and quite successfully at times. I don't go as far as the claims in the op-ed. I don't think that these attorneys were acting unpatriotically or violating their professional duties to represent their clients. That's their job, and I think our system functions better when you have vigorous representation for the defense as well as the prosecution. However, I was quoting the New York Times when I was told about this thing. I said, what's the big whoop? I mean, I don't really understand why people are getting so exercised about this. And we had an election. President Obama won. Under the Constitution, President Obama is ultimately responsible for the execution of the laws. He should put people into office who agree with his policies on those laws. And so there's nothing wrong for him to put those people into positions of responsibility in the Justice Department if he wants to have those policies. The only thing about it I find unfortunate is that the Justice Department just didn't immediately reveal to everybody who these folks were and what they were working on. There's nothing wrong with it. The thing that's wrong is if you try not to be open about it. I mean, these are the reason we have elections, so that we can then understand the policy of the administration. And if Congress and American people want to hold the administration responsible for disagreements they have with those people and their policies, that would be fine. But if I'd been in the Justice Department at the time, I would have released all their CVs, and I would have released the CVs of every single political appointee in the government. I mean, that's the right of the people to know that. That's, I think, the real problem with that whole dust-up. I don't think, I know several of the attorneys who are listed as being in the Al-Qaeda 7. I think they're decent, honorable people. I had no problems when they were representing the other side when I was in the government, and I'm glad they did, and I'm glad that they are able to serve in the government now. I very much disagree with the policy views they hold, and I would not take the same positions on several of the issues that they have taken, but they should be allowed to serve in the government for a president who's putting them into office because he and they are on the same page on terrorism policy. And that's what we really should discuss, is whether those choices are the correct ones.
Professor Yu, I want to join with George Gillum. I'm a member of the board of the Miller Center, and I want to apologize for these disruptions. You're entitled to give your talk, and you're entitled to take the questions, and I'm sorry there have been disruptions.
Thank you.
As you said, welcome to Charlottesville, Berkeley on the East Coast. I have a question, and I've written it down, so I apologize for that. I want to be precise. You were trained as an attorney and counselor at law, underscore that second phrase, a broader responsibility than just interpreting legal language. Did you believe, as you authorized the enhanced interrogation techniques for CIA to use against high-value detainees in the war on terror, that there was any question as to the wisdom of embarking upon a course of action that was such a dramatic departure from previous U.S. military and intelligence practices in this area? In short, did you worry that you may have gotten the law right, but the application wrong?
It's a very good question and a very tough question, and I appreciate it. And I obviously didn't think about this just at the time, but I've thought about it a lot afterwards. And it really has to do with how you think of your job. I hate to bore the non-lawyers here, but it depends very much on what you think your job as a lawyer is in the government. And so to me, it seems to me there has to be a clear distinction between law and policy. And your question, in fact, is about the policy, it seems to me, not the law. And in fact, although you might be surprised, I share actually this distinction that you draw. And I think it's actually extremely important in this respect. I could, and perhaps did, hold the view that even though the law permits one to interrogate this much, that policy, wise policy, would have the government do this much. What I would reject is the idea that because I held that policy view, I should change the way I interpret the law to make this reduced down to this. I think what my job would be, and I think this is quite at odds with the views that some or many scholars of legal ethics hold. But I think it's a very old-fashioned view. I think my job would say, here's what the law says. And again, I'll say, it is not a surprise to me that that's controversial where we drew those lines. And I do believe wherever we drew them, people would be angry at me. But those lines are here. As a person then speaking, not because of any legal expertise or training, but as someone just in the government, I might think the policy would better be pursued here. right? I understand lots of costs and benefits to these decisions. There's no perfect answer. It's really the decision of where you trade off pros and minuses of any policy. That's what being in the government is about. I mean, if these were easy decisions, you wouldn't need to elect people to make them. But because they all call on people to make terrible trade-offs, war, unfortunately, is the worst in demanding on the government to trade off terrible costs and benefits against each other. So my point is, I was certainly entitled to and could give my answer to the government, not just on the legal issue, but on the policy question. But I think it's also incumbent on me to be very careful to say, I'm not interpreting the law when I give you this advice. It's just my personal view. And you shouldn't defer. Certainly the last thing you should do is defer to my view because I'm a legal counselor. This is just, I think you might be making a mistake, but that's just my piece of advice. So I actually want to talk about Iraq for a second, because I think this is actually even more clear with the Iraq war, right? Congress authorized a war in Iraq. The president decided to wage it. No matter what one's view on war powers is, about whether Congress has to decide first or the president decides first, I know the Millis Center conducted an extensive multi-year study on this question with an excellent report, actually, that came out about it. Just because the Constitution said legally you could wage a war in Iraq doesn't tell you anything about whether it's a good idea to invade Iraq. And I think that is the same question that we confronted there. And I will say, and this is the last thing I'll say, is I don't feel like I'm at liberty to say what my policy views were. I do think that the attorney-client privilege requires me to respect the confidentiality of the discussions I held within the government. Now, the government itself is releasing a lot of this information now in public, and when they do, I'm happy to talk about it, but I really think until they do, I really, as an attorney, cannot say what my policy advice was in addition to my legal advice. But I'm happy to share it once the government says it's okay.
Mr. Yu, I would also first like to express my thanks to you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today and to share some of your views with us.
Thank you.
As I look around the room, I note that your presentation is being attended by a number of highly respected legal scholars in our country. I know my good friend, Professor Abraham, over here, one of the country's leading constitutional experts. And I believe this serves in some testimony to the purpose of your visit here. This is the times I've been to the Miller Center over the past several years. This is not normally the way we conduct business here. And most of us come here with an open mind to listen to what the speaker has to say. And this is the first time I've ever experienced others being here to try to prevent us from doing so. To my question, and I apologize for that minor digression. Thank you, Joseph. My question is, I have read your book, and as I go from Washington to Lincoln, of course, Washington had to start with kind of a blank slate and had to fill in a lot of blanks to get his administration started. Lincoln had less of a blank slate and less holes to fill in. But he did seem to aggressively, and in hindsight, to the benefit and to the very survival of our nation, act very aggressively, particularly vis-a-vis the Chief Justice Taney at the time. And he set aside, seemingly, very quickly, a number of norms and practices that had been respected, certainly by his predecessor and by other predecessors of his office. And in terms of respecting certain provisions of the Constitution. And then if you move to Roosevelt, I'm not trying to filibuster. I'll get to Roosevelt in the same theme. My question is at what point do you say that a president, in the interest of his country and in the interest of the security of his country, has truly exceeded all reasonable powers? And who is to judge that? And where do we find any kind of regulatory control over that proposition? Thank you, sir.
It's a very good question. First, I don't want to be read as saying that every time presidents try to expand their power, it's a good thing, and that they're always going to be great presidents who try to expand their office for its own sake. I hope, I don't think I was very clear, but I hope one thing that comes through that it's really dependent on history, that there really has to be a meeting of the president and the powers and the circumstances of the time. And that in periods when the country is not in emergency crisis, the president should not seek or exercise broad constitutional powers. Again, I think the framers set it up so that these powers are really only suited for the rare cases, like the periods I talked about. You talked about the Civil War, World War II, and so on. And that, in fact, presidents can really be mistaken and go too far when they try to use those kinds of powers for the wrong time. So Andrew Johnson, I think, is a good example, and Richard Nixon is a good example directly response to your question. Andrew Johnson essentially wanted to maintain sort of military-style control of Reconstruction policy, with the president just dictating policy and generals carrying them out in the South. Congress thought that it ought to play more of the role as we shifted more to peacetime. Even though it wanted a tougher peace, it still thought that we were at peace and that they would be responsible. And I think Johnson's claims did go too far. They weren't criminal and worthy of impeachment as a high crime, but it was, I think, going too far in terms of the constitutional power. And I think Richard Nixon is the same way. And Richard Nixon also made very large claims of presidential power, but which were being used for the purpose of pursuing his domestic political enemies. I mean, the use of the commander-in-chief power and national security powers was not in any way really related to the real function, which was to protect the country. He was doing it for personal reasons, to protect himself and to attack the Democratic Party, and that was a mistake too. So I do think the one agency of the government that really isn't suited to do it in the middle of the crisis is the Supreme Court, who we all today look for the answers. And we are living through this period now of judicial supremacy, where the Supreme Court does claim it has the final word on interpreting the Constitution. And we look to it even today. If you look at the Supreme Court and its practice in previous wars on these exact questions you raise, they will eventually reach the question, but they will do it after the fighting is over. And the reason why I think it's a mistake to ask the court to be the final regulator, as you suggested, during the conflict, is because I think courts used to understand this, are badly suited to making decisions at national levels that go beyond one case and that could incur very high costs to the country in a very short period of time. And that's why I think the Constitution does grant those powers instead to the president working with Congress.
John Yoo, thank you very much for being here today, and thanks to our audience for being so respectful.
Thank you.